The nurse walked down the quiet street, her shoes worn and her uniform slightly creased from the long day at the hospital. Her feet ached, and her mind was still racing from the endless tasks she had completed, checking patients, giving medicine, listening to complaints, and doing everything that went unnoticed but was necessary to keep the hospital running. Life had never been easy for her, but she had grown used to it. Every day was a challenge, but she found small moments of joy in the smiles of patients who got better because of her care. That evening, something unusual happened. She received a call from a charity organization inviting her to a special gala. At first, she thought it was a mistake. She had never been to such events, and the idea of being in a grand hall filled with wealthy, important people felt completely out of place. But the woman on the phone insisted it was meant for her. "We need someone from the medical staff to attend," she said. "Your presence will be appreciated. Please come." After a few minutes of hesitation, she decided to go. Perhaps it was fate, or perhaps it was just curiosity. She dressed in her simplest formal attire, her heart pounding with nerves. As she arrived at the grand hall, she could hardly believe her eyes. Crystal chandeliers sparkled from the ceiling, and polished marble floors reflected the soft light. Waiters in black suits carried trays of champagne, and people dressed in expensive gowns and suits laughed and spoke in voices that seemed far too polished to be real. The nurse felt out of place immediately. Her hands, calloused from hours of work, brushed against the smooth fabric of her dress as she tried to calm her racing heart. She reminded herself that she didn't belong here, that she was just an ordinary person in an extraordinary place. She moved quietly along the edges of the room, hoping no one would notice her. It was then that she saw him, the Millionaire host. He was a tall man, perfectly dressed, with a look that made people feel small just by standing near him. His eyes scanned the room, sharp and calculating, and when they landed on her, she felt a shiver run down her spine. He approached her slowly, a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "You," he said sharply, pointing at her. "Come here." The nurse froze. She didn't know why he was talking to her, and her instincts screamed at her to move away, but something inside her made her take a small step forward. "You look different," he said, studying her. "Tell me, can you play?" The nurse blinked. "Play? I can't," she stammered, unsure what he meant. "Don't lie to me," he said, his tone leaving no room for refusal. "I saw you looking at the piano. You're going to play for us tonight." Her heart stopped. Play? In front of all these people? She had not played in public in years. The piano in the hospital lobby sometimes called to her, and she had played quietly when no one was watching. But she had never imagined performing in front of strangers, especially not in front of someone like him. Fear gripped her, her knees trembling as she realized there was no way to refuse. You can't expect me to," she began, but he interrupted her. "Do it, now." The Millionaire gestured toward a grand black piano at the far end of the hall. Its polished surface gleamed under the chandelier lights, as if challenging her to approach. The nurse's stomach twisted. She glanced around, noticing the curious eyes of the guests. Some were smirking, others whispering, and a few were staring with mild interest. None of them knew her, none of them cared about her life, but tonight, she would be their entertainment. Her mind raced with memories of her childhood. She remembered sitting at an old, slightly out-of-tune piano in a small, dimly lit room. Her mother had encouraged her to play whenever she could, telling her that music had the power to calm even the heaviest heart. She had loved the feeling of her fingers on the keys, the way the notes seemed to float through the air like small miracles. But life had been harsh, and piano lessons had stopped long ago. Work and survival had taken priority. Now all those memories came rushing back, but with a weight that made her feel trapped. She was being forced into a situation she had never asked for, and fear threatened to choke her. She could hear her own heartbeat, loud and uneven, and for a moment, she thought she might collapse right there, but she took a deep breath. She had survived worse moments in her life, moments where her courage and determination had been tested. This was just another test, though it felt different. The eyes of strangers were heavy on her, their judgment sharp and immediate, but she had no choice. Slowly, almost reluctantly, she walked toward the piano. Each step felt heavier than the last. The millionaire followed her, his gaze never leaving her face. "Faster," he said, as if he could see her hesitation. "Play something, anything. Impress us." The nurse's fingers hovered above the keys. She could feel the cold, smooth surface, and it reminded her of all the times she had dreamed of playing beautifully, without fear. She closed her eyes for a moment, trying to remember the tunes she had loved as a child. The soft melodies, the ones that had made her heart swell, now became her only guide. When she finally pressed the first key, the sound was quiet and shaky. A small, trembling note filled the hall. Some guests glanced around, smirking, ready to enjoy her failure. But then she pressed another key, and slowly the music began to form. It was simple at first, imperfect, but there was a sincerity in it that no one could ignore. The nurse's fear did not disappear, but it began to transform into focus. She remembered her mother's words about music calming heavy hearts, and she thought about the patients who had smiled because of her care. Perhaps she realized this music could do the same here, not for herself, but for the people who were listening. The millionaire's smirk faltered slightly. He had expected laughter, embarrassment, and perhaps a quick retreat, but the music was steady. It had a rhythm that captured attention, even if it was not perfect. Some guests stopped talking, leaning forward to listen. The nurse felt her own surprise at what she was creating. The piano was no longer a symbol of fear. It was her voice, her secret courage made audible. Even as the first few notes rang out, she felt a strange mixture of vulnerability and power. She was exposed in front of people who had power, wealth, and influence, yet in this moment, she controlled something they did not, her music. It was hers entirely, and though fear still lingered, it no longer dominated her. The room was quiet now. Even the millionaire seemed unsettled, unsure how to react. The nurse's hands moved with more confidence, guided by instinct and memory. Each note was a small victory, a tiny rebellion against the fear that had threatened to paralyze her. By the time she reached the middle of her first melody, some guests were visibly moved. A few whispered to each other, astonished that such skill had come from someone they assumed would fail. The nurse did not look at them. She focused only on the piano, letting the music guide her through a world that had seemed too big, too intimidating just moments ago. And so the nurse, who had walked into the hall trembling with fear, began to discover something extraordinary. She realized that courage was not the absence of fear, it was acting despite it. The piano, once a symbol of her childhood dreams, had now become a bridge between fear and possibility, between her ordinary life and an extraordinary moment she could never have imagined. By the time the first part of her performance ended, the hall was silent. The millionaire's expression was unreadable, caught somewhere between surprise and disbelief. The guests, too, were speechless, unsure how to react. In that silence, the nurse felt something she had not felt in a long time. Pride. Pride in herself, her talent, and her courage to face fear head-on. And though she did not yet know what the rest of the night would bring, she knew this: something had changed. Something inside her had shifted, and no matter what happened next, she had already proven to herself that fear could be faced, even in the most unexpected places. After the first few notes, the nurse felt her hands steady slightly, but the tension in the room was almost unbearable. She could feel the eyes of every guest on her, some filled with curiosity, others with expectation, and a few with a hint of mockery. The millionaire stood beside her, his arms crossed, watching her intently. There was no warmth in his expression, only a sharp, critical gaze that made her want to shrink, yet somehow pushed her to focus even harder. The hall, which had moments ago seemed like a fantasy world, now felt like a cage. Every polished surface, every glittering chandelier, every soft shadow reminded her that she was not supposed to belong here. Yet, as her fingers brushed the keys, she realized that for the first time in years she could speak without words. The music was becoming her voice, even though fear still lingered like a shadow behind her eyes. A small murmur rose from the guests. Some were whispering to each other, wondering who this nurse really was, and why she had the courage or audacity to play in front of such an elite crowd. Others quietly watched, unsure whether to mock or appreciate. The nurse tried not to notice, but the sound of whispers made her heart race. Her hands were slightly trembling again, and a wave of doubt threatened to take over. The millionaire's voice cut through the room. "Faster, play like you mean it. Don't waste time." The nurse froze for a moment. "Faster?" Her fingers were not trained for speed, and she had never performed under pressure like this. The words felt like a challenge, almost like a threat. She wanted to retreat, to run back to the quiet safety of her small apartment, to forget this nightmare and pretend it never happened. But something inside her resisted. She remembered the long hours she had spent helping people, the times she had faced exhaustion and fear at the hospital, and the moments when she had quietly persevered despite everything. Slowly, she pressed the keys again, her movements cautious but deliberate. The melody was no longer shaky. It was deliberate, tentative, but filled with emotion. She let her memories guide her, the small tunes she had played as a child, the songs that had given her comfort in difficult times, the notes that had made her feel alive even when life was harsh. The millionaire's frown deepened. He had expected humiliation, not music that demanded attention. He stepped back slightly, crossing his arms, and for the first time, the nurse felt a flicker of confidence. Perhaps she was doing more than surviving this moment. Perhaps she was beginning to shine. The guests leaned in, their whispers quieting as curiosity grew. Some had expected an awkward, clumsy performance, but instead, they were hearing a melody that, while simple, carried a depth that surprised them. The nurse could feel the subtle shift in the room's energy, a mixture of tension and admiration. It was intoxicating but also terrifying. As she continued, she remembered the small victories of her life, the first time a patient had thanked her with genuine warmth, the nights she had stayed late to care for someone no one else could, the moments when her small acts of kindness had made a real difference. Each note she played now was a reflection of that resilience, that quiet strength she had carried for years. A guest whispered to another, barely audible, "Who knew she could play like that?" Another shook their head in disbelief. "She looks so ordinary." And yet, the nurse ignored the comments, focusing on the piano. She could feel the fear melting slightly, replaced by determination. Each note became easier, each melody more confident. It was still intimidating, still daunting, but it was no longer paralyzing. The millionaire, however, was not ready to concede. He stepped closer, his voice firm. "Keep going. Make it impressive. Show us something extraordinary. We don't have time for simple tunes." The words struck her like a challenge. Could she rise to it? Could she turn this moment, which had begun in fear and humiliation, into something that truly reflected who she was? She pressed the keys harder, letting her emotions pour into the music. Each note was stronger, more expressive. She was no longer just playing, she was telling a story through the piano, a story of struggle, courage, and quiet resilience. The guests were now fully attentive. The whispers had stopped, replaced by a focused silence. Even the millionaire's frown seemed to waver. There was something in the way she played that commanded attention, that made people forget their social masks for a moment. It was not just skill, it was honesty, sincerity, and emotion. The nurse felt a strange sensation. Her fear had not disappeared, but it had transformed into something powerful. She realized that the piano had become more than an instrument. It was a bridge between her world and theirs, between ordinary and extraordinary, between fear and courage. A few guests exchanged glances, surprised at their own reactions. "She's good." "Really good," one murmured. "She's incredible." Another replied quietly, almost in awe. The nurse did not look at them. Her focus was complete, her mind and heart entirely absorbed in the music. She felt free in a way she had not in years. The fear that had seemed unbearable at first was now a part of her, guiding her, pushing her to express something real and human. The millionaire's impatience grew, but so did his curiosity. He had expected embarrassment, not this transformation. He could not look away, and for the first time that evening, he was unsure how to react. The nurse had turned his command into an art he had not anticipated. Suddenly, a soft smile appeared on the face of an elderly guest in the crowd. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was genuine. The nurse felt a small surge of hope. If her music could touch even one person, perhaps this moment would not be entirely about fear and humiliation. Perhaps it could be about something more. The millionaire's voice broke the silence again, sharper this time. Faster, more emotion. Don't hold back. The nurse's heart skipped a beat. She could have panicked, could have let the fear take over, but instead she embraced it. The fear had become part of her performance, a source of energy that made her music more expressive, more alive. She let her fingers move faster, guided by instinct and memory. And the melody became richer, more intricate, filled with emotion that no one had expected from someone like her. Guests leaned forward in their seats, captivated. Some were smiling in disbelief, others were silent, caught up in the music. The nurse had done something extraordinary, not just playing notes, but transforming fear into expression, doubt into courage. She could feel their attention, their surprise, even their admiration, though she did not allow herself to notice too much. Her focus was entirely on the music. The millionaire's arms dropped slightly. He had expected her to fail, but now he was unsure. This was no ordinary performance. The nurse had taken the fear he had imposed and turned it into something genuine, something moving. He realized that, for the first time that evening, he could not control her. The nurse felt a swell of pride and relief. Fear still lingered, but it no longer ruled her. She had survived the first wave of pressure. And she had done more than survive. She had performed, and in doing so, had revealed a part of herself she had hidden for too long. When she finally slowed the melody, letting it fade into silence, the hall remained quiet for a moment. No one spoke. The guests seemed unsure whether to clap, to comment, or simply to absorb what had just happened. The nurse's hands rested gently on the keys, and she dared to breathe again. The millionaire's eyes narrowed, but there was something different now. A grudging respect, perhaps, or maybe the realization that she had more to offer than he had imagined. He did not speak immediately. Instead, he watched, studying her, as if trying to understand how someone so ordinary could command such attention and admiration with nothing but a piano and courage. The nurse, meanwhile, felt a strange mix of exhaustion and exhilaration. She had faced fear head-on, in front of strangers and someone who had intended to intimidate her, and she had not only survived but had created something meaningful. The music had become her voice, her shield, and her power, and so Part 2 ends with the nurse standing at the piano, her heart still racing but stronger than before. The tension in the room is high, but a subtle shift has occurred. The millionaire's arrogance has met its first challenge, and the guests are beginning to see something extraordinary in the nurse. She knows this is only the beginning. Fear is still present, but so is courage. And in the next moments, she will have to decide whether to let that courage fully take over, or let doubt creep back in. The nurse's fingers hovered above the keys for a brief moment, catching her breath after the first round of music. The silence in the hall was almost overwhelming. She could hear the faint rustle of expensive dresses and the quiet shuffle of polished shoes on marble floors. Every guest seemed frozen, as if the music had paused their very thoughts. The millionaire, who had begun the evening expecting humiliation and amusement, now watched with something closer to disbelief. For a moment, fear returned, sharper than before. Could she really continue? Could she maintain this delicate balance between her trembling hands and the melodies she wanted to create? Her mind flashed to her small apartment, the cramped kitchen where she had once practiced on an old, battered piano. She remembered the quiet nights when the world seemed too big and unfair, and the piano had been her only friend. Those memories brought a sense of calm and determination. She pressed the keys again. This time, the melody was stronger, more deliberate. She let herself feel each note, imagining the music as a story flowing from her heart to the ears of the people in the hall. The piano responded beneath her fingers, its smooth keys guiding her like old friends. Fear was still there, lurking at the edges, but it had softened into focus. The millionaire's eyes narrowed as he leaned forward slightly. He had expected hesitation, failure, or embarrassment, but she was doing the opposite. Her music was not perfect, but it was alive. There was emotion in every note, a sense of realness that could not be manufactured. He had underestimated her, assuming that her status as a nurse meant she had no talent, no courage, no presence. And now he was forced to reconsider. The guests, too, were changing. Their whispers of mockery had vanished. Instead, curious glances became attentive, and a few faces showed subtle admiration. Some leaned forward in their seats, captivated by the raw sincerity of her playing. The nurse could feel it, though she tried not to look up. Every eye in the room was on her, every gaze weighing her down. Yet simultaneously lifting her spirits, a subtle smile appeared on the face of an older guest, a woman with kind eyes who had been observing quietly. It was almost imperceptible, but it was there a silent acknowledgement that what the nurse was doing mattered. The nurse felt a small spark of hope. If her music could touch even one heart, perhaps this moment was not only about fear, humiliation, or expectation. Perhaps it could become something more. The millionaire's voice broke through the quiet. "Faster! Show us something extraordinary! Don't hold back!" The nurse's heartbeat quickened. She could have panicked, could have let the fear take over, but she remembered all the times she had faced difficult situations and had emerged stronger. She took a deep breath and let her hands move faster, letting the music carry her rather than thinking too much about each note. The melody became more expressive, more intricate, each note a reflection of her courage and determination. The guests were now fully captivated. They had expected a timid, awkward performance, yet they were hearing something unexpectedly moving. It wasn't about technical perfection, it was about honesty, feeling, and the courage to perform in a situation that could have broken anyone. The nurse's music spoke to them, even if they did not yet understand why. Her fingers moved more confidently now. The initial fear had transformed into energy, a driving force that made the music alive. Each note was a small victory, each melody a quiet defiance against the circumstances that had brought her here. The millionaire's expression shifted from arrogance to uncertainty. He had assumed control over this moment, but now it was slipping away from him. A few younger guests whispered to each other, barely audible. "She's amazing." "I didn't expect this at all." "She's incredible," another replied quietly. Almost in awe, the nurse ignored their comments, her focus entirely on the piano. She let the music guide her, letting each note flow naturally. She could feel her emotions pouring into the melody, an unspoken story of struggle, fear, hope, and resilience. For the first time in years, she felt entirely present, alive, and in control of something. Even if only for a moment, the millionaire, still standing nearby, could not hide his growing fascination. He had never seen someone so ordinary command attention in such a powerful way. She was not wealthy, not influential, not famous, and yet she had everyone in the hall completely absorbed in her music. That realization seemed to unsettle him more than any insult could. The nurse's fingers moved faster now, but with purpose. She was no longer playing to survive or obey. She was playing to express, to show herself, to reveal the part of her that had been hidden behind long shifts, exhaustion, and fear. She remembered the patients she had cared for, the times she had pushed herself beyond her limits, and the countless small acts of bravery she had performed quietly. All of that energy flowed into her music. A few guests exchanged glances, clearly moved. Some nodded, others whispered in disbelief. The nurse felt the subtle power of connection, the realization that music could bridge worlds, cross social divides, and touch hearts even in the most unlikely settings. The millionaire cleared his throat, attempting to regain control. "Slower, emphasize the emotion. Make it unforgettable." The words could have added pressure, but instead the nurse embraced them. She adjusted her tempo, letting the notes breathe, creating a rhythm that drew listeners in. The music became richer, layered with subtle emotions, longing, courage, fear, and hope, all intertwined in a story that was uniquely hers. The room was silent, yet alive with anticipation. Even those who had initially doubted her could not look away. Some were leaning forward, holding their breath, as if afraid that even the slightest pause would break the spell. Others had tears quietly forming in their eyes. Moved by the unexpected depth of her performance, the nurse's fear had not disappeared entirely, but it had transformed into determination and presence. She was no longer just a nurse standing in front of strangers, she was a storyteller. using the piano as her voice, her bridge, and her courage. The millionaire, usually so composed and in control, now seemed unsure. He had expected to assert dominance over her, to watch her fail, and perhaps to amuse himself and the guests. Instead, he was witnessing something genuine, something unexpected. His smirk had vanished, replaced by a curious mixture of respect and incredulity. The nurse felt a moment of pride, subtle but powerful. She had turned fear into expression, doubt into confidence, and pressure into energy. Every note she played was a victory, a demonstration of her resilience, and proof that ordinary people could achieve extraordinary things when they dared to try. The guests were now completely silent, entirely absorbed in her performance. Their initial judgments, assumptions, and social expectations seemed to vanish in the presence of something real, raw, and human. The nurse's music was no longer just a performance, it was a shared experience, connecting her to everyone in the room. Her hands moved effortlessly now. The melodies were flowing, sometimes soft and tender, sometimes strong and bold. She could feel the emotion in every note, and she knew that the people listening could feel it too. The music was no longer about fear, survival, or obedience. It was about presence, courage, and humanity. The millionaire stepped back slightly, his expression unreadable. He had never expected this outcome. He had assumed control, thought he could intimidate, but he had misjudged. The nurse had taken the moment and transformed it into something extraordinary, something he could neither predict nor control. The nurse slowed the melody, letting the final notes linger in the air. Silence filled the room, deep and complete, as if the hall itself was holding its breath. The guests were frozen, caught between disbelief and admiration. The millionaire's gaze softened, though only slightly, as he studied her. For the nurse, the silence was a moment of reflection. She had faced fear, pressure, and judgment, and had not only survived, but had created something meaningful and beautiful. Her heart still raced, but it was not only from fear, it was from exhilaration, pride, and the quiet joy of expression. And in that moment, she realized something important. Courage was not the absence of fear. It was the act of moving forward despite it, of creating beauty even when the world seemed set against you. Part 3 ends with the nurse standing confidently at the piano, her music having transformed the atmosphere of the hall. The millionaire watches, unsure of his next move. The guests are captivated, and the nurse herself feels a newfound sense of strength. She knows the night is far from over, but she has taken the first step in proving that even in the face of fear and doubt, ordinary people can achieve extraordinary things. The nurse's hands moved across the keys with growing confidence. The fear that had dominated the earlier moments of the evening was no longer the master, it had become a companion, a quiet reminder of how far she had come. Every note she played told a story, one of struggle, perseverance, and hope. The grand hall, once intimidating and cold, seemed to transform with each sound she created. The chandeliers above shimmered, reflecting light across the faces of the guests. Their expressions caught between admiration and disbelief. The millionaire, who had initially intended to intimidate her, now found himself silently watching. His usually sharp and commanding demeanor had softened, though he would never admit it aloud. The woman he had thought would fumble and fail was commanding attention in a way he had never expected. Her fingers danced over the keys, creating a melody that was not just music, but emotion made audible. The audience had fallen completely silent. The whispers and murmurs had ceased. Even the most skeptical guests leaned forward, caught up in the unexpected beauty of her playing. For a moment, the world outside the hall did not exist. There was no wealth, no hierarchy, no judgment, just the nurse and the music flowing from her hands. She had started with simple melodies, but as her confidence grew, so did the complexity of her playing. She allowed herself to express fully, letting the music reflect the highs and lows of her life. The quiet moments of sadness, the brief flashes of joy, the constant struggle to persevere, they all wove into the tune she played. Each note carried weight, each chord held meaning, and slowly, the entire room began to feel it. The millionaire's frown had disappeared completely. He had expected control, dominance, and perhaps amusement at her expense. Instead, he was confronted with talent and courage he had underestimated. He realized that he had misjudged her entirely, and for the first time that evening, he felt a strange mix of humility and astonishment. He could no longer see her as just a nurse, just an ordinary person. She was something more. A few guests were visibly moved. One elderly woman wiped a small tear from her eye, while a younger man sat frozen, clearly touched by the depth of feeling in the music. Even the staff serving the event paused for a moment, caught in the unexpected power of the performance. The nurse could not see them all, but she could feel their attention, their emotions. The connection forming silently in the room. As she continued, she allowed herself to experiment with the melody. She added soft flourishes here, gentle pauses there, giving the music an ebb and flow that made it even more compelling. She was no longer performing out of fear, she was performing out of desire to express, to communicate, to share a part of herself that had long remained hidden. The millionaire's impatience had vanished entirely. He now observed quietly, his arms at his sides, studying her every movement. He noticed the subtle shifts in her expression, the concentration in her eyes, and the grace in her hands. He had never thought that someone in her position could evoke such emotion, command such attention, and hold an audience so completely. He could feel himself being drawn into the music, despite every instinct telling him to remain detached. The guests' reactions continued to change. Some who had initially been smug or dismissive were now leaning forward, their eyes wide with surprise. Others whispered softly to their neighbors, struggling to find words to express what they were feeling. "I didn't expect this," one said. "She's incredible." Another shook their heads slowly, muttering, "So ordinary, and yet so extraordinary." The nurse was aware of the shift in the room. The fear that had driven her at the beginning had evolved into a quiet confidence. She could feel her heartbeat steadying, her breath becoming more controlled. The music had taken over, guiding her hands and her emotions. Each note seemed to flow naturally, as if it had been waiting for this exact moment, for her to bring it to life. As she reached the middle of her performance, she decided to push further. She began a more complex sequence, one that required skill, precision, and emotional depth. Her fingers moved swiftly, yet with grace, producing a melody that was both delicate and powerful. The hall seemed to respond. Every sound echoed perfectly, every note resonating with the polished walls, the gleaming floors, and the attentive audience. The millionaire could no longer hide his amazement. He had expected embarrassment and fear, but he was witnessing artistry, courage, and talent all in one person. He realized that the nurse had transformed the moment completely. She was no longer the timid outsider. She was the center of the evening, the reason everyone was silent, the reason hearts were beating a little faster in awe. The nurse's mind wandered briefly to her patients back at the hospital. She thought about the lives she had touched, the people who had smiled because of her care, the moments when she had gone beyond herself to help someone in need. She realized that all of those experiences had prepared her for this moment, had built the courage and patience she needed to perform under pressure. Her music was not just talent, it was the result of years of perseverance, kindness, and quiet strength. The audience began to sense this as well. The music conveyed not only technical skill, but the essence of her character, the resilience, empathy, and determination that defined her life. Each note was a testament to the quiet battles she had fought, the fears she had overcome, and the hope she carried within her. The millionaire shifted uncomfortably. He had been so sure of his power, so confident in his ability to control the situation. But now, he realized that he had underestimated the strength of someone he had deemed ordinary. The nurse was showing him, without words, that courage and talent could exist in anyone, regardless of status, wealth, or expectation. A young guest, unable to contain herself, whispered to her companion, "It's like she's telling a story we can all feel." Her companion nodded, eyes fixed on the nurse. "I didn't expect to be moved like this," he admitted quietly. The nurse's music reached a gentle crescendo. She allowed herself a brief moment to smile, not for the audience, but for herself. She had faced fear, had overcome it, and was now expressing something deeply personal. The piano had become more than an instrument. It was a bridge between her inner world and the hearts of everyone in the hall. As the final notes lingered in the air, the room remained silent for a beat longer than expected. No one moved, no one spoke. The energy was palpable, the impact of her performance settling over everyone present. The millionaire finally exhaled slowly, a hint of admiration breaking through his usual stern demeanor. He realized that tonight he had witnessed something rare, something genuine and unforced, moment of true talent and courage. The guests began to clap. Softly at first, then louder, their applause growing into a wave of appreciation that filled the hall. Some were wiping tears from their eyes. Others were smiling broadly, unable to hide their astonishment. The nurse rose slightly from the piano, her hands trembling with a mixture of exhaustion and exhilaration. She had done more than survive the pressure. She had captured hearts, changed perceptions, and proved her strength. The millionaire stepped forward, a gesture of recognition and respect that surprised even him. He nodded slightly, as if acknowledging her achievement without words. He had attempted to force fear upon her, to dominate her with authority, but she had transformed the moment into something extraordinary. In doing so, she had reminded everyone present, including him, that true talent and courage could never be controlled or underestimated. The nurse took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the evening, the intensity of the performance, and the genuine appreciation of those who had witnessed it. Fear was still there, lingering faintly, but it no longer held power over her. She had faced it, embraced it, and turned it into something beautiful. Part 4 ends with the nurse standing at the piano, her performance complete, yet leaving an impression that would linger long after the final note had faded. The millionaire watches with a new respect, the guests are captivated, and the nurse herself feels a profound sense of accomplishment. She has not only performed under pressure, but has transformed fear into courage, doubt into confidence, and a simple melody into a story that everyone in the room will remember. The applause filled the grand hall, echoing off the high ceilings and polished walls. The nurse's hand still rested on the piano keys, slightly trembling from the adrenaline, but her heart felt lighter than it had in years. She had faced her fear, performed under impossible pressure, and created something beautiful that no one could have expected. The room had changed because of her, and for the first time in a long time, she felt that her worth was recognized not because of her job or her status, but because of her courage, her talent, and her honesty. The millionaire, standing nearby, took a slow step forward. His eyes, which had been sharp and critical earlier, now softened slightly. He had intended to command, to intimidate, to watch her squirm under pressure, but she had done the opposite. She had transformed fear into artistry, and his authority had been rendered irrelevant by her resilience. For the first time, he seemed to reflect on the person before him, not a subordinate or a source of amusement, but someone extraordinary. "Bravo," he finally said, his voice steady but carrying a hint of respect. He nodded toward her, acknowledging her performance without unnecessary words. It was the first time all evening he had truly recognized her as more than an ordinary nurse. He had expected to dominate, to impress, or humiliate, but instead, he had learned something far more valuable, that courage and talent cannot be measured by social status or wealth. The guests continued to clap, some rising to their feet, their faces shining with admiration. There were whispers of astonishment, with comments about the unexpected brilliance of her playing. Some who had doubted her initially now seemed genuinely moved. They had come expecting a simple performance, maybe even a moment of light entertainment, and they had received a genuine display of courage and skill. The nurse felt a quiet pride, but she also felt humbled by the reactions. She had shared something deeply personal, and the response had been overwhelmingly positive. Her mind drifted briefly to the hospital, to the quiet nights she had spent caring for patients, often unnoticed, often exhausted. She realized that all those small acts of perseverance and kindness had shaped her, had built the courage that allowed her to face this challenge tonight. Her life had been ordinary, sometimes harsh and full of struggle, but it had prepared her for moments like this, When strength and resilience were tested under pressure, the millionaire finally spoke again, this time with an unusual tone of humility. "I misjudged you," he admitted, his voice quiet but sincere. "I thought I could control this evening, and I expected fear to dominate. But you've shown something far beyond what I anticipated. That was remarkable." The nurse nodded politely, acknowledging the words without arrogance. She did not seek praise. She had not performed to impress anyone. Her performance had been a personal journey, a testament to her courage and perseverance. Yet, hearing acknowledgement from someone so powerful felt different. It was a validation, not of her worth as a person, but of her ability to rise above fear and doubt. The evening continued. The atmosphere shifted completely. Guests approached her, offering words of admiration and respect. Some asked about her life, curious to know more about the woman who had surprised them so thoroughly. She answered with quiet humility, sharing small details of her work at the hospital, her love for music, and the moments that had shaped her courage. Every conversation reinforced the idea that her story, her talent, and her perseverance mattered, and that ordinary people could indeed inspire extraordinary reactions. The millionaire lingered, observing silently. He had assumed that fear and intimidation were tools of control, but tonight had taught him a different lesson. Respect, admiration, and genuine influence came from talent. Courage and authenticity, not wealth, status, or arrogance. The nurse had reminded him in the most unexpected way that real power could emerge from the most unlikely sources. For the nurse, the night was transformative. She realized that her life had changed in more ways than one. Doors that had once seemed closed or unreachable now felt slightly open. Opportunities she had never imagined seemed possible, not because of luck, but because she had demonstrated courage, talent, and resilience in the most challenging circumstances. The evening had shown her that she was capable of far more than she had believed. As the gala wound down, the nurse stepped away from the piano, feeling a mixture of relief and pride. She had faced fear, judgment, and intense pressure, and she had emerged stronger, more confident, and more aware of her own abilities. The applause, the whispers of admiration, and even the millionaire's reluctant respect were all acknowledgments of what she had achieved, not just in music, but in courage and character. A few moments later, as the crowd dispersed, the millionaire approached her again. "I want to thank you," he said quietly. "Not just for the performance, but for reminding all of us that courage and talent are not measured by wealth or status. You've left an impression tonight that none of us will forget." The nurse smiled softly, appreciating the sincerity in his voice. It was not about recognition or reward. It was about respect and acknowledgement. She had faced fear and emerged victorious, and that was enough. Yet, hearing the words reinforced the truth she already knew, that courage, perseverance, and authenticity could change perceptions, inspire others, and even alter the dynamics of power. As she walked through the grand hall one last time, she noticed the lingering glances from guests who had been captivated by her music. Some smiled warmly, others nodded in quiet admiration. She realized that her performance had done more than entertain. It had touched hearts, shifted perspectives, and reminded people of the power of honesty, courage, and talent. Outside the hall, the cool night air greeted her like an old friend. The city lights twinkled in the distance, and for the first time in a long while, she felt a sense of freedom. The fear that had dominated her evening had not vanished completely, but it had lost its power. She had faced it, transformed it, and emerged stronger, more confident, and ready to embrace whatever opportunities awaited her. In the following days, her life began to shift in subtle but meaningful ways. Colleagues at the hospital noticed a change in her demeanor, a newfound confidence, a quiet strength that inspired others. People she had never expected to notice her now spoke with respect and admiration. And though she continued her work with the same dedication and humility, she carried with her the knowledge that she was capable of extraordinary things when courage guided her actions. The millionaire, too, seemed to be changed by the evening. He had expected control and submission, but he had been met with courage, skill, and authenticity. He learned that true respect could not be commanded, only earned. The nurse had earned it not with words but with action, talent, and the bravery to face fear in front of strangers. The story of that night would linger for years, whispered among guests, remembered by those who had witnessed it. It was not just a story about music or performance. It was a story about resilience, courage, and the unexpected ways ordinary people could inspire extraordinary reactions. The nurse had turned fear into power, doubt into confidence, and a simple piano melody into a testament to human potential. Even in quiet moments afterward, she would recall the sound of the piano, the weight of the audience's gaze, and the thrill of overcoming fear. Those memories were hers to keep, a reminder that courage and authenticity could shine through even the most intimidating circumstances. She had not only survived the night, she had transformed it, leaving a lasting impression on everyone present. In the end, the nurse's life had changed, not because of wealth, fame, or recognition, but because she had discovered the strength that had always been inside her. The experience showed her that courage is not the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite it. Talent is not measured by status, but by the ability to connect, to express, and to inspire. And the human spirit, when nurtured with resilience and authenticity, can achieve far more than anyone ever expects. The night ended with a quiet sense of triumph. The nurse had faced fear, commanded attention, and transformed a moment of intimidation into an extraordinary story of courage and talent. The applause had faded, the lights dimmed, but the impact remained, both on the audience and within her. She had proven, most importantly to herself, that ordinary people could rise to extraordinary challenges, and that, even in the face of fear, courage and perseverance could lead to unforgettable achievements. And as she walked away from the gala, the piano still echoing in her mind, she carried with her a simple but profound truth: fear is temporary, courage is enduring. And every person has the power to surprise themselves and others when they dare to embrace their own potential.